My name is Eleanor Hayes, and 1 week after my wedding, my mother-in-law stood on my front porch with a notary public and a stack of papers, smiling like she was doing me a favor, while trying to take what my grandmother had left me. I remember the knock clearly. It was a sharp, confident knock, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, pearls around her neck, and a man in a gray suit beside her, holding a leather folder, my stomach tightened. I didn't know yet how much that moment would change the tone of my marriage, but I knew something wasn't right. A week earlier, my wedding day had been quiet and simple. At our age, my husband Frank and I didn't want anything grand. We were both in our early 60s, widowed, once cautious the second time around. The ceremony took place at our small Methodist church in Indiana, the same one where I'd sung in the choir years ago. We had punch and sheet cake in the fellowship hall, hugged our friends, and drove home before sunset. I didn't mention the inheritance that day. Not to Frank, not to his family, not to anyone standing near the gift table. 3 small apartment units my grandmother had owned in a neighboring town, paid off modest, nothing flashy. I'd inherited them quietly, 6 months earlier after she passed at 92. She'd lived a careful life, clipped coupons, balanced her checkbook to the penny, and told me more than once, money makes people strange. Ellie, keep it simple. So I did. Frank never asked about my finances, and I appreciated that. He worked part-time at the hardware store and had his pension from the county. I lived comfortably on Social Security, my savings, and now discreetly the rental income from those apartments. I didn't hide it out of shame. I hid it out of caution, because I knew his mother. Margaret Hayes had a way of asking questions that felt like compliments. "Oh, Eleanor, you always seem so put together. How do you manage?" Or, "You've lived in this house a long time. Must be nice not to worry about rent." She framed curiosity as concern, and concern as entitlement. Frank brushed it off. "That's just Mom," he'd say. "She likes to feel involved." The first few days after the wedding, everything seemed fine. Margaret brought over a casserole. She insisted on reorganizing my pantry while I made coffee. She asked about our honeymoon plans. There weren't any. And whether we'd thought about long-term arrangements. I assumed she meant healthcare wills, that sort of thing. Then she asked about property. "So, Eleanor," she said casually, wiping her hands on a dish towel, "did your grandmother leave you anything of significance?" I felt my spine stiffen. "Just memories," I replied, smiling. She watched me closely, the way a card player watches the table. "Well," she said lightly, "it's important to keep things transparent in a family." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't correct her. I just nodded and changed the subject. That silence, what I didn't say, was the smartest decision I made. Because 7 days later, there she was on my porch. "This is Paul," she said brightly, gesturing to the man in the suit. "He's a notary. We won't take long." Frank wasn't home. He'd gone to help a neighbor fix a fence. I stood there, one hand on the doorframe, the other gripping the edge of my cardigan. "I'm not expecting anyone," I said. "Oh, I know," she replied, stepping forward anyway. "But this is important. It's about protecting family assets." Paul gave a polite nod, eyes already scanning the hallway behind me. I didn't invite them in. Margaret sighed, as if I were being difficult. "Eleanor, at our age, it's foolish not to prepare. Frank and I talked, and we think it's best to get some paperwork squared away, just in case." "In case of what?" I asked. "Well," she said, lowering her voice, "if something were to happen to you, or Frank, we don't want confusion." Paul shifted his weight. "It's very straightforward," he added. "Just acknowledgments, signatures." I could feel my pulse in my ears. I didn't need to see the papers to know what they were about. She hadn't come for reassurance. She'd come for control. "I don't sign anything without my lawyer," I said. Her smile faltered just slightly. "A lawyer. Eleanor, this is family." That's exactly why I replied. She straightened pearls, catching the light. "Frank would want this." "I'll talk to Frank," I said. "You can leave the papers with him." Her expression hardened. "We're already here." And I'm saying no. There was a pause, the kind that stretches a second into something heavier. Paul cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should reschedule," he said gently. Margaret looked at me as if I'd betrayed her. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." "No," I said quietly. "You are." They left without another word. The porch felt colder after they were gone. That night, when Frank came home, I told him everything. His face drained of color as I spoke. "She brought a notary?" he asked. "Yes." He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "She had no right." I didn't say I told you so. I didn't need to. We both understood something important had shifted. What I didn't tell him, what I still hadn't said, was why she'd come so fast, so sure of herself. She thought there was something to claim, and she wasn't wrong. But she wasn't entitled to it. Not then, not ever. The next morning, the house felt different. Not quieter, just tighter, like the walls had leaned in overnight and were listening. Frank barely touched his coffee. He kept staring at the table, his jaw working back and forth, the way it did when he was trying to keep calm. I busied myself at the sink, rinsing a mug that was already clean, giving him time to speak first. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I had no idea she'd do something like that." "I believe you," I replied. And I did. Frank wasn't a schemer. He was steady, predictable, the kind of man who paid bills 2 weeks early and returned library books on time. That was part of why I married him. But his mother was another story. "She called me last night," he continued, "after she left here." I turned. "And?" "She said you embarrassed her, said you were being secretive, asked what you were hiding." There it was, the word hiding, as if privacy were a crime. "What did you tell her?" I asked. Frank sighed. That it wasn't her business, that we'd handle our finances ourselves. I felt a flicker of relief, and she hung up on me. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between us. I could tell Frank wanted to say more, but didn't know how. He'd spent his whole life smoothing things over, with Margaret not pushing back. "I need to tell you something," I said. He looked up, eyes wary, but open. "I didn't tell you before, because I didn't want it to matter." I continued. "But your mother didn't just show up out of concern. She came because she thinks there's something to take." Frank frowned. "What do you mean?" I considered my words carefully. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted the truth to land gently. "My grandmother left me 3 apartments," I said. "Nothing fancy. Small units she owned outright. I've been renting them quietly." Frank blinked. Once, then again. 3 apartments. "Yes." "When did this happen?" 6 months ago." "And you didn't tell me." "I wanted to be sure we were marrying each other," I said, meeting his gaze, not the idea of money. He leaned back in his chair, absorbing that. I waited for anger, hurt accusation. Instead, he laughed softly. "Mom always said you seemed comfortable." I didn't smile. She must have guessed, he went on, or assumed. She assumed, I corrected. And assumptions make people bold. That afternoon, I drove to the apartments. I hadn't been there since before the wedding, and I needed the grounding. The buildings were plain brick, built in the 70s, with tidy lawns and mailboxes that clanged shut. Tenants waved as I walked the property. Mrs. Collins asked if her grandson could repaint the porch rail. Life went on, steady and real. That steadiness mattered to me. These apartments weren't just income. They were my grandmother's life's work. She'd scrubbed floors and worked nights at the hospital to pay them off. She'd trusted me to protect them. On the drive home, my phone rang. Margaret. I let it go to voicemail. The message came a minute later. Eleanor, we need to talk. This family doesn't keep secrets. I didn't respond. Instead, I made an appointment with a local attorney the next day. His office sat above a hardware store downtown, the kind with a bell on the door and framed diplomas that had yellowed slightly with age. He listened carefully as I explained everything. You did the right thing, he said when I finished. This kind of pressure is more common than you'd think, especially with older adults. People use family ties to bypass consent. What should I do? I asked. Document everything. Don't sign anything without counsel, and make sure your will is clear. That night, Frank and I sat down together and talked about boundaries. Not just with his mother, but with everyone. We agreed on transparency between us and distance where needed. Margaret didn't take it well. She began dropping by unannounced again, leaving notes, calling relatives. One of Frank's cousins asked if I was keeping assets from the family. Another suggested I was being unfair. I stopped answering the door. One evening, Margaret cornered Frank alone. I know because he came home, pale shaking. She says you're manipulating me, he said, that you're planning to leave and take everything with you. I took his hands. Do you believe her? He shook his head. No, but she believes herself. That was the hardest part. Not the greed, but the certainty. The way she told herself a story where she was entitled, righteous, wronged. A week later, a certified letter arrived. Not from Margaret, but from Paul the notary. It was polite, carefully worded, requesting a meeting to clarify intentions. My attorney smiled when I showed him. They're fishing, he said. Let them. So I did. I stayed silent, again. And that silence, the second one, was louder than anything I could have said. Because the more Margaret pushed, the clearer her motives became. To Frank, to the family, to herself. And soon, everyone would see exactly what she was after. The certified letter sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I touched it again. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. Paul's name was typed neatly in the corner, his tone already familiar, polite official, persistent. It was the kind of letter designed to make ordinary people nervous. I wasn't nervous. By the third day, Frank noticed it too. You're not going to answer that, he asked, nodding toward the envelope. I will, I said, just not the way they expect. I called my attorney instead. He advised a short response firm, factual, unemotional. No meeting, no discussion. Any communication would go through him. When the reply was sent, I felt a strange calm. Not relief exactly, but clarity. The situation had crossed a line. What had started as probing questions and family concern had turned into something formal, something recorded. Margaret didn't like that. 2 evenings later, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on, there was another knock at the door. Not sharp this time. Measured. Controlled. I knew before I opened it. Margaret stood there alone. No notary, no folder. Just her purse, clutched tightly under her arm, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. We need to talk, she said. Frank stepped beside me. Now's not a good time. It's never a good time for her. Margaret snapped, pointing at me. That's the problem. I opened the door wider. "You have 5 minutes." She stepped inside, looking around as if she were taking inventory. Her eyes lingered on the furniture, the framed photos, the quiet order of the room. "I raised my son better than this," she said, sitting without being invited. "I didn't teach him to shut his mother out." Frank's voice was steady. "You taught me to respect people. That includes my wife." Margaret scoffed. "Respect doesn't mean secrets." I sat across from her. "My finances are not secrets. They're private." She leaned forward. "When you marry into a family, things change." "Yes," I said. "They do, but ownership doesn't." Her jaw tightened. "You're being difficult on purpose." "No," I replied. "I'm being careful on purpose." She stood abruptly. "This is exactly what I warned Frank about. Women like you, smiling polite, always holding something back." Frank rose too. "That's enough." She looked at him, then truly looked, and I saw something shift. Control slipping. The narrative cracking. "You're choosing her over your own mother," she said quietly. "I'm choosing what's right," he answered. Margaret picked up her purse. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice low. "Families remember these things." After she left the house, felt heavy, not with fear, but with finality. Something had ended. The next day, I received another letter. This one wasn't polite. It was a formal notice suggesting mediation to avoid unnecessary conflict and hinting at shared marital interests. My attorney laughed when he read it. "They have nothing," he said. "They're hoping you'll fold." I didn't. Instead, I did something Margaret never expected. I invited the family over. A Sunday dinner, simple, pot roast, green beans, nothing fancy. I called Frank's sister, his cousins, even Margaret. I told them all the same thing. I wanted to clear the air. Margaret arrived late, dressed sharply, eyes cold. We sat around the table, plates filled, tension thick enough to taste. I waited until everyone had settled. "I want to be very clear," I began. "There seems to be confusion about my intentions and my assets." Margaret stiffened. "My grandmother left me property," I continued calmly. "It is legally mine. No one else has a claim. Not now, not ever." A murmur ran through the table. "I did not hide this to deceive anyone," I said. "I kept quiet because I value peace, but silence does not mean surrender." Margaret opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. "I will not sign anything transferring ownership. I will not add names, and I will not be pressured." The room was silent. "If anyone has questions," I finished, "they can speak to my attorney." Margaret stood. "So that's it," she said. "You turned family into paperwork." "No," Frank said firmly. "You did." She left without saying goodbye. After that, the letters stopped. The calls slowed. The whispers faded. But the damage had been done. Margaret had shown everyone who she was when she thought there was something to gain. And I had shown myself who I could be when I stopped trying to keep everyone comfortable. The house was quieter after that Sunday dinner. Not awkward, just settled, like dust after a storm. Frank and I didn't talk much about his mother in the days that followed. We didn't need to. What mattered was what we did talk about: plans, routines, trust. The ordinary things that make a marriage real, especially later in life, when you've already learned how fragile peace can be. Still, I knew the situation wasn't over. People like Margaret don't retreat easily. They regroup. 2 weeks passed without a word. No letters, no calls, no surprise visits. Part of me hoped she'd finally accepted the boundary. Another part, older, wiser, knew silence could be strategic. That was when the bank called. It was my local branch, the same one my grandmother had used for decades. The woman on the phone sounded hesitant, careful. Mrs. Hayes, she said we received an inquiry regarding properties registered under your name. Someone asked about adding an authorized party. My grip tightened on the receiver. Who? She paused. Your mother-in-law. There it was. I thanked her and hung up hands steady, but heart pounding. Margaret hadn't backed down. She'd simply changed tactics. That afternoon, I sat in my attorney's office again, sunlight slanting across the desk, dust floating lazily in the air. He listened without interrupting, then nodded. This is textbook, he said. When direct pressure fails, people try institutions, banks, clerks, anyone who might not know the full story. What do I do? I asked. You document, and you lock things down. We spent the next hour updating records, adding alerts, clarifying instructions. He explained elder financial exploitation, how often it happens quietly, through family, through trust misplaced. Especially with widows, second marriages, inheritances, he said. You're not alone. I left his office feeling stronger, not angry, prepared. When I got home, Frank was waiting. She called my sister, he said immediately. Told her you were unstable, said she was worried about my future. I sighed. Did she mention the bank? He nodded. Yes, she claims she was just checking. I sat down across from him. Frank, I need to know something. Can you stand firm if this gets uglier? He didn't hesitate. Yes. That answer mattered more than any document. A few days later, Margaret finally confronted me again, this time, in public, at the grocery store, aisle 6, canned soup. She blocked my cart eyes sharp. You've gone too far, she said under her breath. So have you, I replied calmly. You're tearing this family apart. No, I said. I'm refusing to be torn down. People were watching. She noticed, straightened, lowered her voice. You think you've won, she said. But money has a way of surfacing truths. Yes, I agreed, it does. She stepped back, lips tight. This isn't over. I met her gaze. It is for me. That night, Frank and I sat at the kitchen table and updated our own wills together. Transparent, clear, fair, no surprises, no loopholes. When we finished, Frank reached for my hand. I should have protected you sooner, he said quietly. You are now, I replied. And that was enough. Because standing your ground isn't about shouting or revenge. Sometimes it's about paperwork, patience, and knowing when silence ends and strength begins. The rumors stopped traveling quietly after that. They didn't fade away, they changed shape. I heard about them secondhand. A neighbor mentioned Margaret had been asking around. Frank's sister called one evening, hesitant, apologetic, saying she'd been told I was keeping Frank in the dark. That one hurt, not because it was true, but because it showed how far Margaret was willing to go. So I stopped letting the story circulate without me. I didn't call a meeting. I didn't write a letter. I invited Margaret to lunch. Just her. No audience, no paperwork, no intermediaries. She arrived 10 minutes early, dressed like she was attending court. We sat in a small diner near the courthouse neutral ground. Vinyl booths, chipped mugs, waitresses, who called everyone Hon. Margaret folded her hands. I'm surprised you asked to see me. So am I replied, but it felt necessary. She smiled thinly. If this is about the apartments, it's about the truth, I said gently but firmly. Her smile vanished. I didn't hide my inheritance to deceive anyone, I continued. I stayed quiet because I've lived long enough to know what money does to families. She scoffed. Families share. Families respect boundaries, I said. You crossed mine. She leaned back. I was thinking of Frank. So was I. That stopped her. I know exactly what you tried to do, I said. The notary, the bank, the letters. You weren't protecting Frank. You were positioning yourself. Her eyes flashed. You don't understand how this works. I understand perfectly, I said. And I also understand the law. I slid a folder across the table. Not documents, summaries, dates, notes. Every contact she'd initiated. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. This isn't a threat, I said quietly. It's a boundary. She closed the folder slowly. You'd really do this to family. I already did, I said, by telling the truth. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then her shoulders sagged, just a little. I've always managed things, she said softly. Frank's father left me with nothing but responsibility. And I respect that, I replied. But responsibility doesn't entitle you to control my life. She looked away, jaw clenched. I thought you were weak. I nodded. A lot of people mistake quiet for weakness. When lunch ended, we stood without hugging, without promises. But something had shifted. The air between us felt clearer, colder, maybe, but honest. After that, the pressure stopped. No more letters, no more calls to the bank, no more whispers. Frank's sister apologized. The family stopped speculating. One evening, Margaret sent a short message. Not warm, not cruel. I overstepped. I won't interfere again. It wasn't an apology, but it was enough. Frank read it twice, then once more. That's the closest she's ever come, he said. I nodded. Some people don't know how to say sorry. They only know how to stop. Over time, small things changed. Margaret stopped showing up unannounced. She asked before offering advice. She spoke to me carefully, guardedly, but directly. And I learned something important. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply refusing to be taken advantage of and letting the truth do the rest. Life didn't snap back into place after that lunch. It settled, slowly, like furniture rearranged after years of being shoved into corners. Frank and I found a rhythm that felt earned. Mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings with the television low, and the windows cracked open, listening to cicadas. We didn't talk about the apartments much anymore, not because they were a secret, but because they were no longer the center of tension. They were simply part of my life, like the house I'd lived in for decades, or the routines I trusted. Margaret kept her distance at first. When she did reach out, it was restrained. A phone call about Frank's cousin being in the hospital. A message asking if we wanted leftovers from a church potluck. Ordinary things, neutral things. I accepted them carefully. The first time she came over again, weeks later, she stood on the porch and waited to be invited in. That alone told me something had changed. I won't stay long, she said. That's fine, I replied. Come in. She sat on the edge of the sofa, purse in her lap, eyes, scanning the room, but no longer searching for leverage. We talked about the weather, about Frank's bad knee, about the rising cost of groceries. Finally, she cleared her throat. I shouldn't have brought that man here, she said. I didn't answer right away. I wanted the words to land. It wasn't my place. No, I agreed. It wasn't. She nodded stiffly. I won't interfere again. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't closeness. But it was accountability. And for a woman like Margaret, that mattered. What surprised me most was what happened inside Frank. He grew lighter, less guarded. He stopped bracing himself every time his phone rang. One night, as we washed dishes together, he said I didn't realize how much space her expectations took up in my head. I dried a plate and handed it to him. A lot of people don't realize it until they step out from under it. He smiled at me, then, not grateful, not apologetic, just present. The apartments continued to run quietly. Rent came in. Repairs got handled. I kept my records neat, my paperwork current. My attorney called once to check in, then again, months later, to remind me to review my will annually. Too many people don't, he said, especially as they get older. That stuck with me. I started talking more openly with friends, women my age, widows, remarried, cautious. I didn't share numbers or details, just experiences. And I heard echoes everywhere. Sisters pressured to help out, children assuming ownership, in-laws pushing paperwork for convenience. The stories were always framed as love. But love doesn't rush you. Love doesn't bring a notary to your door. Margaret never apologized outright. I didn't expect her to. But one afternoon, she surprised me. She asked if I'd go with her to the cemetery. Frank was working late. The day was overcast, quiet. We walked slowly between the stones, names etched into granite decades, compressed into lines and dates. She stopped at her husband's grave and stood there a long time. I didn't protect what he built, she said suddenly. I let it slip away. I panicked when I thought Frank might do the same. I understood then, not excused, but understood. Fear can twist people. Loss can make them grab at control. I'm protecting what my grandmother built, I said gently. That doesn't mean I don't care about Frank. She nodded. I see that now. That was the closest we came to reconciliation. Not hugging, not tears, just truth shared without accusation. On the drive home, neither of us spoke, and that was all right. These days, things are calmer, not perfect, real. Margaret comes for holidays. She brings pies. She asks instead of tells. Frank and I make decisions together and stand by them. The apartments remain mine as they should be, not as a weapon, not as leverage, as stewardship. Looking back, I know why my grandmother trusted me. She once told me, people don't take what you give them. They take what you don't protect. I understand that now. What I learned isn't just about money. It's about boundaries, about the quiet power of saying no, about knowing that at any age, especially later in life, you are allowed to protect what you've earned, what you've inherited, what you've built. Silence can be wisdom, but only when it's paired with clarity. And clarity, once claimed, is hard to take away. These days, when I sit on the porch in the early morning coffee, cooling in my hands, I think about how close I came to losing more than property. Not because I was careless, but because I was polite. That's something no one warns you about when you get older. We're taught to be agreeable, to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, because it's not worth the stress. And most of the time, that's true. But there are moments, quiet ones, easily missed, when peace becomes permission. I almost gave it without realizing. If I had signed those papers, if I had let the notary step inside, if I had believed that pressure wrapped in family language was love, my life would look very different now. Instead, I learned that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors you choose when and if to open. Frank and I are still married, not because this test never happened, but because we faced it together. He learned something too, that loyalty doesn't mean obedience, and love doesn't require silence when something feels wrong. Our marriage grew stronger, not from avoiding conflict, but from naming it and standing side by side. As for Margaret, our relationship will never be what it was or what she wanted it to be, but it is honest. She knows where the line is now, and so do I. Sometimes she still slips. A comment here, a suggestion there. Old habits don't disappear overnight. But now, when she does, I don't tense up. I don't rehearse explanations in my head. I simply say, that won't work for me. And I mean it. The apartments are still running, quietly, steadily, just as my grandmother intended. I visit them once a month, talk to tenants, handle repairs. Every time I unlock one of those doors, I feel her with me, not as money, but as effort, sacrifice, dignity. She didn't leave me property so others could claim it. She left it so I could stand on my own. If you're listening to this, and something in it feels familiar, I want you to hear me clearly, especially if you're over 60, remarried, widowed, or managing an inheritance later in life. You are not obligated to explain your finances to anyone except the people you choose. You are not selfish for protecting what is legally and morally yours. And you are not difficult for asking questions, slowing things down, or saying no. If someone rushes you, that's a warning. If someone brings paperwork before conversation, that's a warning. If someone uses family guilt or fear to push you, that's a warning. Love does not need urgency. Respect does not require secrecy. And real family does not demand your signature. Please talk to a lawyer you trust. Keep your documents updated. Make your wishes clear while you're calm, not when you're cornered. And most of all, trust that uneasy feeling in your chest. It's not paranoia. It's experience. I stayed quiet once, and it protected me. I spoke up later, and it saved me. That balance, that's wisdom. If this story made you think of your own life, your own family, your own boundaries, I invite you to pause and reflect. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you believe stories like this, real, grounded, lived, deserve to be told, I hope you'll stay with us, listen again, and subscribe. Because silence has its place, but so does your voice. And it's never too late to use it.